Now, we've talked before about how we can gather data from the terminal screen by using the cin object, but there's more to the story with cin, as well as there's other methods with which we can use to gather data from the terminal screen. And so I want to explore all of these concepts in this video. Now, I know that I'm going to want to work with strings in this little code snippet here. So before we get started, I'm going to include the string library up top. Now, jumping on into our code here, let's say that we want to gather some data about the user. Let's say that we want to get maybe the city that they live in. And so let's create a string variable called city. And then we're going to prompt the user to say, enter the city you live in, right? And after we've done that, we're going to use cin to store whatever they have typed in into this city variable that we've created. And then maybe as a proof of functionality, we'll see out to the screen whatever the city variable now holds, whatever came from the terminal screen and got stored into this city variable by using this cin object. And so all of that being said, let's build and run this. So enter the city you live in. So let's say that they entered in Memphis. And so no worries there. Memphis got stored into the city variable and printed out to the screen. Our code seems to be working. But for giggles, let's say that we're going to enter in a different city name. Let's enter in my hometown. Let's say Virginia Beach is where I'm from. And, well, something weird happens now. We see that the only thing that got stored in that city variable is just the string Virginia. There's no beach at the end of this, right? So what happened there? Well, it's about the mechanics of cin and how cin works. You see, let's run this one more time, and you see that when we run this, cin, what it'll do is it'll skip any leading white space characters. Now, what's a white space? It's anytime you hit the space bar like I'm doing now, or anytime that you hit the tab key like I'm doing now, even anytime that you hit the enter key or any combination of these things. And then let's say that the user enters in New York for this one, right? Basically, all of these leading white space characters are going to get skipped. And then it's going to start reading the data as soon as it encounters a non-white space character, this in New York. And then it's going to start reading that data until it gets to its first white space character again, which is in between New and York, and that's all it's going to record. And well, when we hit enter here, we see that just New was recorded. All of these white space characters were skipped. New got recorded. It stopped recording here in between New and York, just like we were talking about, right? And so if you wanted to get the entire city name and all of its glory recorded, well, you could probably creatively use cin, but there's other methods. So let's explore that a little bit. Let's say that we're going to use something called the getline function. So you call it like any other function by calling its name, getline, and then you put a set of parentheses afterwards because, well, functions take inputs. And this particular function takes two inputs. The first input for the getline function is where are you getting your data from? Well, we're getting it from the terminal, and the name of the object that streams in data from the terminal, well, is cin. We've been working with it the whole time. Now, because it gets more than one input, they have to be comma separated, so let's throw a comma in there. And then the second input of the getline function is where are you going to store this data? Well, we're going to store it in that city string that we made up top. And, well, that, in a nutshell, is how you use getline. And so when we build and run this, now when we enter in New York, well, the entire line is stored in there. Getline will read, white spaces included, up until you hit enter, and that's where it stops reading at. When you hit enter, there's a new line character that invisibly sort of gets inserted at the end of this string, and it reads up until it encounters that new line character. And so That's what gets recorded in there. So all the white spaces that are spaces and tabs get recorded along with it. And that includes the leading white space characters. So for instance, had we hit a bunch of space bars and had we hit a bunch of tabs and then typed in New York, for instance, all of that leading white space is recorded along with it. So if you need to ensure that all of these white spaces are skipped, well, there's different methods for that, and we'll cover that later. But at least getline will get the entire line up until you hit enter, so it'll get the entire city's name, right? So that being said, let's explore some other methods of gathering data from the terminal screen. Say that we want to prompt the user. Say we see out to them, enter your first name, right? Now, say that we don't want their entire first name. Say we just want their first initial. Well, there's a way that you can get just a single character from the input at the terminal screen. And well, let's create a variable up here. We'll create this variable, this character variable. We'll call it F for first initial. And well, let's say that we're in this one to get just one character, we're going to use something called cin.get. It is also a function. It's specifically a member function, and we'll cover more about what a member function is later. But there's a couple of different ways in which you can use cin.get syntaxically, and both of them are valid. And the first way is, well, you can type in F because that's the name of the character that we're storing this, character, our first initial in. That's the name of the character. And we'll say F equals cin.get. And because this is a function, it gets, well, a set of parentheses afterwards for inputs. But when you're using this particular syntax, you don't need to give it any sort of inputs. You can just leave it like this. And at this point, we can just see out to the screen whatever F is and then drop down a line. So F equals cin.get with no inputs gathers, well, the first character that it encounters. And so when we run this again, just because it's easy to type, we'll say New York and, well, enter your first name. Well, my first name is Jeremy. And so now we see that the first initial, J, printed out to the screen. Now, cin.get doesn't just get the first letter that it encounters, to be clear. It gets the first letter that it encounters, period. And so after you've gotten one letter, well, you can say, let's use the other syntax now. The other syntax is like this. You can say cin.get and then put your parentheses afterwards. And then for input, you just specify wherever you want this letter to be stored, this character to be stored. And so we just put in F. And so this right here, cin.get with this input F, is the same thing as F equals cin.get with no input above. And so then we'll just see out F to the screen again, right? And we'll see that the next letter of my name, or if your name is Jeremy too, the next letter of our name is stored in there as well. And so enter your first name, we'll say Jeremy. And so there you go. We cin.get once, there's J. We cin.get another time, and there is E. And as you can guess, if you kept on cin.getting, you would get R and then E and then M and then Y and so forth, right? So that's in a nutshell how cin.get works. But there's something interesting about cin.get. Say that we have this integer variable up here called age, and then we'll come down here and we will see out to the screen, say enter your age, right? And then say we use cin again to get this age and store that in there. And then we see out age again to the screen to see what was actually stored within our age variable. Well, when we run this, so enter the city you live in. I live in Tampa Bay, close enough. It's not really where I live, but pretty close. And so we'll say enter your first name, Jeremy. And now I'm going to hit enter here, but I'm not doing anything else past that. And you'll see what happens is, well, it cin.get a J, cin.get an E. It prompted me to enter my age, didn't allow me to enter in anything. It just says 0 right off the bat. And then process returned 0 is, well, that's that return statement down here. Process returned 0. And so it didn't actually allow me to enter in anything. And sort of what's going on here behind the scenes is that when you're entering in stuff from the terminal screen, well, the whole line is sort of read in, and that line is stored in what they call the input buffer. And the input buffer is just a little temporary storage space. And so anytime that you do cin.get, for instance, it's reading it not really from the terminal screen directly, but it's reading it from that input buffer, that temporary storage space that the whole line from the terminal got stored into. And so we did cin.get a couple of times, but now we're on the, if we were to do cin.get again, we'd be on R. And well, you can see that that input buffer is still half full with data. And then we tried to switch back over to cin, which sort of requires a fresh start on that input buffer. We already have old data in that input buffer for my name was entered in. And so, long story short, sort of skips over the whole entering in your age process. And so you have to clear the buffer. You have to clear that input buffer to start with a fresh input buffer if you're going to switch from cin.get back to cin. And you do that after your last use of cin.get. You say cin.ignore, and this is a function, so it gets a set of parentheses, and it gets two inputs within these parentheses. Now, cin.ignore, the first input that it gets is how many characters do you want to ignore now? Well, we're on R in my name, but we might not always enter Jeremy as a first name. So I imagine that most first names are 128 characters or less. And so let's say that we're going to skip over the next 128 characters in the input buffer. Now you put a comma and it gets another input. And the second input is some sort of condition of where you would like to stop first if you don't need 128 characters. In other words, I'd like to ignore the next 128 characters or until I reach the new line character. Now, I'm getting clever with this new line character bit because when I entered in my name, Jeremy, I hit enter at the end. And when you hit enter, once again, that new line character is tacked on to the end of the data that you input into the terminal. And so I'm going to skip the next 128 characters or until we encounter the new line character, whichever comes first. So this will save this function from having to ignore 128 characters when only a couple might be left, right? Now, this doesn't have to be a new line character. I could be clever if my code and say I wanted to skip up until the M in my name. I can ignore the first 128 characters or until I encounter M. And, well, that would be useful in some scenarios, I guess, if I wanted to get the maybe last character of my name or something. But here I'm going to put a new line character. And notice that it's within these single quotes as well, because that's how you code characters. So I'm going to ignore the next 128 characters until the new line character is encountered, and that should clear the buffer. Now I should have a fresh buffer to work with, and so when I enter in my age now, I'm entering it into a clean input buffer, and this should go back to functioning properly. So enter the city you live in. We'll say New York again, easy to type. Enter your first name. We'll say Jeremy. Enter your age. I'm 42 years old. And notice that it allowed me to enter it this time. And I'm going to hit enter. And that's it. So a bunch of information was covered in this one. We did cin.get, both ways of executing that, both syntaxes for it. We did getline. We covered a little bit more about cin. We cleared the buffer. All of that stuff. So hopefully all of this was clear. I'll see you in the next one.